This presentation will be on the proving flights of the Graf Zeppelin from 1928 to 1931. The picture there that you see, I got from the San Francisco Museum, and that is a picture of the Graf Zeppelin landing in San Francisco after the round the world crossing of the Pacific. So why did I call this proving flights? Well, at the time that the Graf Zeppelin was built, aircraft were small, their flight distances were quite limited. They had to keep landing to refuel, and rigid airships seemed the best option for carrying both passengers and freight over long distances. Many nations invested in rigid or semi-rigid airship, including Germany, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, Italy, and France. From conception, the Graf Zeppelin was designed to prove the feasibility of rigid airship technology for larger airships that would follow. Before entering regular scheduled service in 1932, the Graf Zeppelin had a well-publicized career showing the world what rigid airships are capable of achieving. And when we go through this, you'll see how so many of the flights were designed to show off the technology to as many people as possible. So a little background. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin completed the first successful rigid airship flight in Germany in July of 1900. That airship was called LZ-1, and it was dismantled after 3 flights because of the cost of maintaining it. He built 4 other experimental ships over the next 8 years, and each of them had a short career. There was never a time when there were 2 airships in the air at the same time. By 1908, though, Count Zeppelin had enough financial support because of the success of the experimental ships that he could establish Luftschiffbau Zeppelin to produce rigid airships commercially. And I'm going to apologize now for my pronunciation of German because it's not my language, unfortunately. In 1909, Count Zeppelin founded the world's first airline, the Deutsche Luftschifffahrt Aktionsgesellschaft, known as DELAG, which used Zeppelins to fly both paying passengers and VIPs on pleasure trips around Germany. By July 1914, its dirigibles had safely carried over 34,000 passengers on 15,088 commercial flights. Never had an accident, never had anyone injured. World War I ended the pleasure flights as the German military forces requisitioned the dirigibles. So you see the postcard on this page is actually a souvenir of someone's visit to the Zeppelin Works on September 27, 1913. And it does have an onboard the Victoria Louise hand stamp, but that was probably just applied in the Zeppelin shed. Count Zeppelin died in 1917, and Hugo Echner took over the company. At the time he took it over, the Zeppelin Works were building Zeppelins for the German Navy and Air Force, and they built 85 of them for the military during the war. After the war, the company manufactured 2 small 28-passenger airships and delivered them to DELAG to use for passenger service within Germany. However, the Versailles Treaty had forbidden the production or operation of airships within German territory. And so DELAG had to give the 2 airships up to the Allies in 1921 as war reparations. Literally, when Echner took the organization over, it had over 13,000 employees. He had to keep the best employees with the company if he was going to have a future making Zeppelins. So what they did for a time was produce aluminum cookware and other consumer products to stay in business. The aluminum cookware is stamped Zeppelin, and they're quite valuable now if you find them. In 1923, the US was able to convince its allies to permit Germany to build a non-military dirigible for the naval airship program. The US had purchased a surplus dirigible that the British had stopped working on at the end of the war. And it was being flown on a test flight with an American crew and a British crew. They were teaching the Americans how to fly the airship when it broke up in a storm, and most of the people on board were killed. So that kind of put an end to that was supposed to be LZ-2. So Echner was able to convince the US to place an order with the Zeppelin works to build a replacement. For the Zeppelin company, that was LZ-126, and it was delivered to the US. It took a year and a half to produce, and it was delivered to the US in October 1924. The cover on the left is actually one of the covers carried by LZ-126 on its delivery flight to Lakehurst. Excuse me. What you see on the little picture on the right is actually LZ-126, which was named the USS Los Angeles. And it was used for naval support, although it was a non-military dirigible. They were using it for scouting and things like that. And they took a naval tender and had a mast mounted on it. And you can see the picture of the airship tethered to the naval ship there. After the delivery of the USS Los Angeles, the Allies met in Locarno, Switzerland, and decided that Germany could redevelop its non-military economy. Kind of a bit of a joke, because large parts of Germany had already been taken over by France and some of the other allies, and they didn't give those back to Germany for quite a while. So what was left was a not superior economy. But Echner sought financing to build a commercial Zeppelin, and the Weimar government refused to assist. They were very concerned that if they started building Zeppelins, people would see it as another move for Germany to militarize, and they would tighten restrictions on the German economy. So Echner and several of the wartime Zeppelin commanders traveled throughout Germany and through nearby countries which had high German populations, and they gave lectures and raised money for the Zeppelin Echner Spend, or the Zeppelin Echner Fund. And they sold postcards and they sold labels. So you can see a couple of labels here and a couple of the postcards. One of the postcards says, you know, a German Zeppelin, yes, it will come again. So obviously an appeal to the patriotism of the German people. They gave hundreds of these lectures, and the fund was actually reasonably successful. So with public support, they raised just over 35% of what would be needed to build a new Zeppelin. The government gave in to public demand, and they gave another 15%, and the Zeppelin company actually financed the rest of the construction from the profits that they had made with their consumer goods. The ship was designed by Ludwig Durr, and basically LZ-127, which was the next ship in the Zeppelin's production line, was a stretched version of LZ-126. Because they didn't have any money to invest in infrastructure, the new airship was limited by the size of the construction shed at Friedrichshafen, which was 787 feet long and 115 feet high. So LZ-127 was designed as a long, thin cylinder, 776 feet long, 100 feet in diameter. And the gondola was situated far to the front, where the hull started to raise towards the beginning of the aircraft. That way they were able to fit it in underneath the Zeppelin without forcing it to be any higher. The picture you see here is a postcard showing the construction of LZ-127. So there's the plan that was drawn up. The passenger compartment and everything is, if you can see my cursor, is all here. The crew had hammocks hung along the walkway inside the envelope. And there were 13 gas bags that were designed to carry hydrogen. And then it was kind of an interesting design, because the lifting power, the lifting gas was hydrogen, but it used fuel called bow gas, which was the same weight as air. So where most Zeppelins have a problem where they use gasoline, and when they start using it, they have to vent off helium or hydrogen so the aircraft doesn't keep rising. With bow gas, you used it up, and the place was taken up by air, and it all weighed the same. So they didn't have to keep venting off their lift gas. So the LZ-127 was christened the Graf Zeppelin on July the 8th, 1928, by the daughter of Count Zeppelin, Countess Brandenstein, and it was actually christened on the 90th anniversary of his birth. The Graf Zeppelin was built with 33 tons of duraluminium, had 5 powerful Maybach propeller engines, and a total gas volume of 105,000 cubic meters. As I said, when I was talking about the layout, it used hydrogen as the lifting gas and blau gas as the fuel. Blau gas had been invented by a German scientist using cooking stoves. So kind of an interesting choice. The picture you see here is the daughter of Count Zeppelin christening the Graf Zeppelin. And this picture is actually the Graf Zeppelin being removed from the shed on its first time out. The Graf Zeppelin could carry a net load of 15 tons when you didn't count the weight of the fuel, the crew, and the equipment. Or it could carry 20 passengers, about 26,400 pounds of mail or freight over a distance of 6,250 miles and an average speed of 60 to 7 miles per hour. As you can see, when planes were being limited to, 30 or 40 miles per leg, it was an exceptionally big advantage. She made her first flight on September the 18th, 1928, and Hugo Echner was actually the commander. 2 days after that first flight, Germany issued the first 2 Zeppelin stamps, and they're shown here on the lower picture. And they show the Graf Zeppelin flying over the world. The Graf Zeppelin did 6 local test flights and short flights around Germany. And then she began her first intercontinental flight on October 11th, 1928. She carried 40 crew, 20 passengers, and 66,000 pieces of mail on her maiden flight to America. The onboard marking that you see in the blue oval on the card, my cover that's shown here, was actually applied in the Friedrichshafen post office because the airship's post office was not yet operational. And the picture here shows the New York Times the day that Graf Zeppelin first came to Lakehurst. The first flight lasted 111 hours and 44 minutes. And the picture you see in the upper right, you can see the crew standing on the structure with a big opening in front of them. Unusual for Echner, who was usually a very cautious pilot, they entered a storm front at full speed, and it ripped a whole bunch of the skin off the fin. And Echner knew they couldn't fly that way because the skin would keep ripping. So he asked for volunteers, and 4 volunteers went forward and patched up the damage by re-sewing extra skin over the gap. One of those volunteers was his son. And they were able to repair it. To do that, though, they had to stop the engines. So they would go down very close to the water and let the guys work, and then they would start it up again and go up and then turn off the engines. Well, when the engines weren't going, the propellers weren't going, which meant they weren't generating any electricity, which meant they couldn't send messages. So the US press was covering the disaster that had occurred to the Graf Zeppelin. When Echner knew that the repairs had to be done, he did send out an emergency signal to say that they had some damage and stand by in case they needed help. So the world really thought that it had crashed. Passengers on the first flight included Hearst reporter Lady Grace Drummond Hay and U.S. Naval Officer Charles Rosendahl. The reason I mention those two particularly, Lady Grace Drummond Hay was a very popular reporter in this era, and she did a lot of the first flights. She not only was she on this flight to America, but she also was on the round the world flight, which comes up later. And she did a number of first aircraft flights. Charles Rosendahl was a famous US airship pilot, and later on ran the US Naval Air Base at Lakehurst. He was the commander of that base when the Hindenburg crashed. On the return flight, where passengers actually paid, the first woman to be ticketed a passenger on a transatlantic flight, Clara Adams, was on the flight back to Germany. The cover you see on the left is actually signed by Lady Grace Drummond-Hay. And as I said, she was quite a popular figure in her day, and somebody's asked her to sign this cover. It's interesting because she was not on the flight that this cover is from. So somebody's taken a cover and asked her to sign it. The picture on the lower right is a British schedule for Graf Zeppelin flights for 1934, and it has been signed by Clara Adams, which is why I've included it, because kind of another personality that people at the time knew. On the return flight to Germany, the Graf Zeppelin carried almost 52,000 postcards and 50,000 letters mailed by aviation enthusiasts. Now, this was a time that the post office was advertising Zeppelin mail to get the revenue from the sale of postage stamps. And the US Post Office applied a purple hand stamp to every card and letter that said first flight airmail United States to Germany. And it was loaded, they were all applied before the mail was loaded onto the Graf Zeppelin in Lakehurst. So in 1929, the first large flight was to the Orient. The demand for Zeppelin mail surprised Echner. He wrote in his book, "At the time in the winter of 28-29, I had not yet comprehended the degree to which the interests of the great newspaper enterprises and of stamp collectors could be exploited to supplement the receipts from carrying passengers." But Echner was an exceptionally smart man. He had actually been a reporter in his career, and he had been hired by Count Zeppelin to do the marketing for the company. And he knew that to be successful, they had to have favorable press coverage so that the public would have faith in Zeppelins. And so, as I said, the first international flight of 1928-9 was a 3-day flight to the Holy Land. So you can see the purple cachet that says the Orient Flight 1929. And these are both were carried on the Graf Zeppelin on that flight. Interesting that the British at this time were developing their own imperial airship scheme. And so they pressured Egypt to refuse to allow the Graf Zeppelin to fly over their territory, because at that time, Egypt was still under the British sphere of influence. In April 1929, the Graf Zeppelin conducted a 2-day flight over the Mediterranean Sea with official mail drops in 5 places. This cover was the regular hand cancellation for the one that says Friedrichshafen airmail, but some of the mail on this flight had a machine cancel, which was being used in the Friedrichshafen post office, and that is actually worth more money if you can find them. This cover has this strike on the back, which shows that it was dropped into Sevilla. Then on May 16th, the Graf Zeppelin set out on her first flight to the US for 1929. On the first evening, 2 engines failed, and Echner made the decision to return to Germany. That proved to be a really good decision because as they were trying to fly up the Rhone Valley, 2 more engines failed. Now, they only had 1 engine left, and they were trying to go up the valley against high winds. France had always refused to allow Zeppelins to fly over their territory. That was because the French had always hated the Zeppelins, and they called them baby killers from the war. But in this case, France granted emergency permission to land at one of their air bases. And when the Zeppelin landed, it was surrounded by French forces, and the crew were kept under very close guard. The engines, they had to sit there until new engines could be sent from Friedrichshafen, and they were installed, and then the airship made it back to Friedrichshafen under its own power. It was later found out that one of the engineers had tinkered with the engines to improve their performance, and it messed them up. So all of the mail was on this flight was returned to Friedrichshafen, and that red marking you see at the bottom was applied. It basically says interrupted first flight to America for 1929. So then on August 1st, after a major engine overhaul and 2 one-day flights in Germany, the Graf Zeppelin sent out again for America. Here are 2, one's a card, one's a cover, prepared by stamp dealer A.C. Rossler. This is one of his caches, the yellow Zeppelin picture. On the postcard, which has the 2-mark stamp, on the back it has the red interrupted flight marking, and the cover has it on the front. So both of these pieces were on the original flight to America that was interrupted, and then were held until the next flight to America, which occurred in August. This was actually, for Germans, they always thought this was the start of the round the world trip. But the largest backer declared, which was Hearst newspapers, declared the flight had to start and stop in the United States. So Echner wrote in his book, My Zeppelins, it was a task of the commercial department of the Zeppelin company to demonstrate the usefulness of the Zeppelin under all conditions throughout the world and to obtain experience in all of its zones. How better could this be done than in a flight around the world? So he started seeking financing to pay for this round the world trip in early 1929. He was able to get Hearst to give a large amount of money, and German newspapers also paid for some of the costs to have reporting rights in Europe. And then postage carried paid the rest of the costs. So the actual passenger revenue created a profit on this flight. So this was the first flight that generated a profit for Delague since the war. You can see this postcard was mailed in Germany. It was to be unloaded in Tokyo, and you can see what the German post office did was put markings on them to make sorting the mail easier. So this is Friedrichshafen to Tokyo, and you can see that sort of across the middle of the postcard in a mauve color. This card was mailed in Friedrichshafen, unloaded in Japan, and then sent on to Great Neck, New York. So obviously unloaded in Lakehurst. All of the mail in the US that was loaded onto Graf Zeppelin had this US post office first round the world flight cachet applied by the post office department. The flight from Lakehurst began on August the 7th and arrived back in Lakehurst on September the 4th. The route was Lakehurst to Friedrichshafen, Friedrichshafen to Tokyo, Tokyo to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles to Lakehurst. Flying time was 12 days, 12 hours, and 13 minutes. So this flight set a number of records, including the first passenger flight around the globe, the first non-stop Pacific flight by any sort of aircraft, the fastest circumnavigation of the globe up to that time. And collectors could obtain mail from the whole flight or from each leg of the flight. The reason Tokyo was chosen, kind of a bit of a humorous situation, Tokyo was an ally during the First World War, and their reparations included an old Zeppelin shed that was dismounted and sent to Tokyo. They never used it for Zeppelins, but in this case, it could be used for the Graf Zeppelin on the round the world flight. Following the round the world flight, the Graf Zeppelin conducted 14 flights throughout Germany and to Switzerland, Spain, and the Netherlands before its winter overhaul. And I include this cover. It's a handmade cover. It's cut out a piece of cardboard. It's not super attractive, but the British were working on the R100 and R101 for the Imperial airship scheme at this time. And Echner arranged for the Graf Zeppelin to fly to Cardington in April 1930, so lift ship bow Zeppelin could show its technology to the British rigid airship builders. He was always hoping the British would order parts or equipment from his company in Friedrichshafen. A large part of the profits for Delague came from convincing governments to issue postage stamps and pay a large percentage of those to the airline. Echner had negotiated for the issuance of special stamps in Germany, which you see at the top, in the United States, and in Argentina. That generated a significant amount of profitability. In 1930, the Graf Zeppelin did a flight from Friedrichshafen down to Recife, then to Rio de Janeiro, where it sat on the ground for 2 hours, held down by over 400 sailors because there was no mooring mast for it. It then went back to Recife and then northwest to Lakehurst and back to Europe. The cover on the top, on the right-hand side, was loaded during the landing in Sevilla. And then the cover on the bottom was loaded in recipe for the flight to Lakehurst. That cover is signed by Hugo Echner, which is the only cover I have that was signed by him. He apparently signed so many covers, his staff used to complain about the amount of time he spent, and he used to joke about the fact he was just devaluing his signature. The US Post Office agreed to pay Delag 93.5% of the revenue from the stamps on any carried mail. Now, the post office thought that that would be, collectors would just jump at these stamps, and so they printed 1 million of each of the 3 values. Unfortunately, this was right in the middle of the Depression, and the post office only sold a total of 227,000 stamps, and they had already told the public that they would destroy the rest later that year, so they did. So the Graf Zeppelin stamps are actually the scarcest American issue of the 20th century. And this cover you can see was, has the flight cachet, first Europe, Pan American round trip applied by the US Post Office. Hugo Echner never forgot that the Zeppelin was there really because so many German people had contributed small amounts of money to help raise the funds necessary to build it. And so whenever he could, he made sure that the airship could be seen by the German public. And this is a cover from a local flight in Germany, from Hamburg to the airport at Philatelic. On the Around the World trip, the Graf Zeppelin had to carry government representations of each of the countries they flew over. And there was a commissaire on board from the Soviet Union. They wanted Zeppelin to fly, they wanted Echner to fly the Graf Zeppelin over Moscow, but he was concerned at that point about how much fuel it was going to take to get to Tokyo and the weather, so he declined that invitation and just flew over the northern part of Russia right to Tokyo. The Germans then received an official complaint from the Soviet Union that they had been slighted, and so President Hindenburg requested that Echner take the Graf Zeppelin to visit the Soviet capital. So in September 1930, that happened. Echner arranged for special Russian stamps to help offset the costs. And you can see that the stamps are actually already designed to commemorate the achievement of the 5-year plan in 4 years. And they simply added a Zeppelin to the design of the stamp that was going to be issued. The Soviet Union, of course, being what it was, made it really difficult for collectors to get the stamps and send them on mail. You had to pay double because you had to pay it in regular postage plus the Zeppelin stamp. And they only allowed so much mail to be processed. So Echner didn't make a huge amount of money from this flight. But for collectors, it's great that there's not a lot of covers. Then the airship did a flight over the Baltic. It was supposed to land in Helsinki, but bad weather canceled the flight. And there was actually 13 passengers who were supposed to disembark in Helsinki, but they had to stay on board till it returned to Germany. Mail was dropped at Riga, Tallinn, Helsinki, and Stockholm. And they dropped a rope and picked up a bag of mail in Helsinki. So Finland issued a special stamp that was good only for this flight, and you can see it above the cover. This was the cachet that was applied to all mail carried on the flight, the Baltic Sea flight. In 1931, the Graf Zeppelin flew to Hungary. So I don't think I mentioned the fact that when it actually went to Moscow, the Graf Zeppelin was met by 100,000 people. When it flew to Budapest in 1931, it was met by 20,000 people. I mean, people could not get enough of rigid airships at this point. There was a one-day flight around Hungary after it arrived, and then the return flight to Friedrichshafen. Hungary put out 2 special postage stamps, most of the revenue going, of course, to Delag for any carried mail. This is one of the largest cachets applied on board the airship during its flights. And you can see that this cover was mailed in Hungary for the flight around Budapest. Then the second flight to the Middle East started on the 9th on April the 9th, 1931. And after crossing the Mediterranean to Libya, the Graf Zeppelin flew over Alexandria to Cairo. This time they were allowed to go over Egypt. The Graf Zeppelin actually hovered over the peak of the largest pyramid for an hour before it flew on to Alexandria. And then it circled Jerusalem. Egypt overprinted 2 stamps for Zeppelin mail. Now it's actually the same stamp, but they printed one for 50 mil and one for 100 mil for mail to be carried on this flight. Eckner did not go on for the flight around Egypt. He stayed and spoke to the king, he was hoping he could convince King Fahd that Egypt should have Zeppelins, and they would order with his company. In 1931, Germany issued a 1 mark stamp for local flights in Germany. And the Scott Catalog actually calls this the first Zeppelin stamp, but it was issued 2 years after the others. Liechtenstein issued 2 stamps, and Iceland overprinted 3 stamps for mail for the flight to Iceland that it was in the museum, the Perlin Museum last weekend. And they actually have 2 pictures. They show pictures of Reykjavik in 1930, and they actually include 2 photos of the Graf Zeppelin coming into land. Although they do not say that it's the Graf Zeppelin, they don't say what it is, but they're great shots. Then in 1931, probably one of the most famous Graf Zeppelin flights. So now the Graf Zeppelin had flown around the world. When it went to South America the first time, it had crossed the equator. It had flown in the tropics, and it had flown in the north, up to Helsinki in the Baltic Sea. This time it was flying to the Arctic. And so the plans were made, and Hearst sponsored part of the flight. There was supposed to be a submarine that was being operated by an American explorer, and he wanted to take a submarine to the North Pole. So Hearst agreed to pay, I think, $100,000 if the 2 met up and they traded passengers and mail, $50,000 if they only met up, and the less amount if they didn't meet up. Well, the submarine couldn't make it. It had technical problems. So Eckner was able to arrange to meet a Russian icebreaker, the Malagan, off Franz Josef Land, and exchange mail. You can see that they actually landed the Graf Zeppelin, or hovered, on the water. This is a picture taken from the deck of the Malagan as the mail was being taken over to the airship. Germany issued 2 stamps for this flight, and the Soviet Union actually issued 4, and they did them both regular and imperforate. So there's actually 8 different Russian stamps with the same design for this flight. Then in 1931, less than 10 months after the disastrous crash of the British Zeppelin R101, the Graf Zeppelin made her 2nd flight to England. After landing in London, the airship did a flight over the city and nearby counties. And Eckner was hoping that the British government would continue with the Imperial airship scheme, but would decide that Zeppelins manufactured in Germany would be better than trying to develop their own. That, of course, never happened. The British decided to scrap the Imperial airship scheme because the crash of the R101 in France actually claimed the air minister, who had been the biggest fan of the plan. So in 1931, there was a large German business community in Brazil, and Delag launched regular service to South America starting in August of 31. They were able to convince a number of South American countries to issue special stamps for mail to be carried on the Graf Zeppelin. And the Graf Zeppelin could get to South America in 5 days, which was almost a week faster than ocean vessels. So they were touting this as quite an advantage. And because mail was such an important part of funding for the Graf Zeppelin flights to South America, this cover actually has a purple hand stamp that was applied in the post office on the Graf Zeppelin. And basically it says that the Graf Zeppelin will be waiting in Pernambuco, which we know as Recife, for 5 days for their reply to Germany. So they were trying to encourage people to use mail on the Graf Zeppelin back to Germany to answer any mail they had received. Starting in 1932, really, the Graf Zeppelin went into a regular flight schedule, did 9 South American flights in 1932, 8 in 33, 12 in 34, 16 in 35, and 13 in 36. And although it did that, it was the other flights that tended to receive the most attention from stamp collectors and from the public. When the Nazis came to power, Dr. Goebbels ordered that the Graf Zeppelin take him and German officials to Rome to meet with the government of Mussolini. And this flight was marked with a number of stamps by Italy and its colonies. Beautiful stamps. And this cover you can see with the cancellation has a San Marino stamp and has the Rome cachet. The Germans had a different cachet for this flight. The next flight you see here was the Chicago exhibition flight. And this had a flight at the request of the people operating the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago in 1933 to bring the Graf Zeppelin as the outstanding aeronautical technology of its times to the fair. Echner would only agree to do that if there was some financial assurance. And so the Baby Zepp stamp was issued. Interesting if you ever want to sort of pursue an interesting study in how stamps and politics go together. This issue of stamp was quite interesting because there was a lot of anti-Nazi feeling by now in the United States, and President Roosevelt forbid the issuing of a stamp. And then when the German post office said they were issuing 2 special stamps, and you can see one on the middle cover for this flight to America, the State Department told President Roosevelt that refusing to issue stamps would probably be seen as a slight to the German government. And so he authorized the issuing of the 1 50-cent Baby Zepp stamp. On the second flight of 1927, returning from South America, the crew was informed that Hindenburg had crashed. They did not inform their passengers of the Hindenburg disaster until they had safely arrived at Friedrichshafen. The picture you see here is one of the engine nacelles, and it was rescued and is in a museum now in Munich. Flown to Frankfurt only on June 18th, she was hung in a hangar and deflated. And then in 1940, she was dismantled upon the orders of Reichsmarshal Göring. During her career, she flew 1.7 million kilometers, becoming the first airship to fly over 1 million miles. She carried 13,110 passengers and 106,000 kilograms or 235 pounds of mail and freight. In total, she had flown for 17,177 hours or 717 days or nearly 2 years without injuring a passenger or crew member. So I just wanted to put in, if you're at all interested in collecting this kind of material, there's lots of resources. And you can collect, balloons or semi-rigid or rigid airships. There are people that specialize in single airships or destinations or certain countries. Now you can collect the stamps, the Posa history, or the Cinderellas. You can collect by country or airship, or route, cachets, people, or even specific flights. And there's lots of reference material available, both in print and online. Major catalogs include the Seeger Zeppelin Post Catalog, the Michel Zeppelin Specialized Catalog, the Frost Special Airship Mail and Postcard Catalog. I really like the Frost, but it hasn't been printed since 2005. And so they're a little hard to find now on the aftermarket. Michel puts out a new Zeppelin catalog every couple of years, but only puts out one in English about every 10 years. And the Seeger, which is often used by dealers to identify the stamps and routings, It is no longer in print, and it is becoming a bit more difficult to find. And this is really the end. I just wanted to show you a picture of the Graf Zeppelin at Los Angeles in 1929 with a Goodyear blimp beside it. This was on the flight back from the Around the World trip. And certainly, the Graf Zeppelin has successfully proved the reliability and safety of Zeppelin technology. But the crash of the Hindenburg and advances made by aircraft manufacturers really brought the rigid airship age to an end at the start of the Second World War.